Keeping the real Reformation alive, one topic at a time. Doth protest, doth protest, doth
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Doth Protests, a podcast on Reformation history and theology. James and I are here today. How you doing, James?
Doing all right. Doing all right. How about you, Drew?
Good. You just got back from vacation?
Yeah. A couple weeks ago, went down to the Outer Banks with Rachel and the girls and my side of the family. So yeah, that was good. Yeah, enjoyed some time away.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. We interestingly, my parents came down, my mom and stepdad came down here to Louisiana. Typically we go up to Michigan every year, usually almost always during the summer, just because Rachel's a school teacher and that's when we can go. But and it's just nice to go up there when it's down here is in the heat. But yeah, so I didn't realize you and I, we both kind of had a time off around the same time. So
Yeah.
just different kinds of time off. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well,
And
and we're gonna have to head up to Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh area early next week because we're Rachel's grandfather died a couple of days ago, and so we're gonna go for his funeral.
yeah, so I thought of that after we hit record. I was like, because I just saw it on Facebook, and I didn't know if I wanted to bring that up on the show, but I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, prayers are with you and her family and y'all's family. Um, so yeah, we're going to talk today about I guess today's episode is kind of related to our last episode. And
Yeah.
without giving too many spoilers, kind of related to our next episode as well. Um, and because we're looking at, well, Lutheranism again, but uh, we're looking at the second generation of Lutheranism, really. Um, really, the second half of the 16th century. We're looking at our last episode was, of course, on Melanchthon. And that really just looked at Melanchthon and Luther's theological development and their relationship as well, and the discernible influences, of course, that one had on the other. I think mutual, but we of course spoke a lot about Melanchthon's influence on Luther. And now we're looking basically after looking at how Lutheranism developed after the death of Luther, especially, but then, after the death of Melanchthon, I mean, these two guys are, kind of considered I mean, obviously, I mean, Luther, it's in the name. I mean, Lutheranism was the name given to the Reformational movement out of Germany that Luther initially started, which Melanchthon, of course, very much developed. And so once they're both gone, we're left with their descendants in a way, as in like students of theirs, fellow pastors of theirs, and they were seen as, uh, they were often deferred. A lot of things were deferred to them while they were alive. A lot of things were they were kind of seen as leading spokesmen. And with them gone, what did the people do? So I think it'll make for an exciting episode. You know, and so I guess we're kind of covering this is going to turn into two episodes, I think. We're going to cover the time span pretty much from Luther's death to the publication of the Formula of Concord. I guess I should say a word about the Formula of Concord. That's published, I believe, in 15, was it the 1580s, James? Do you
Uh,
1577?
That sounds maybe right. Yeah.
1577, so 400 years before the first Star Wars movie. Um, Weird reference, I know. Uh, and it's
1580, 1580.
1580. Okay. So and that's the kind of it could be seen as the definitive statement on what Lutheran theology is. The thing is, there's also the Augsburg Confession from 50 years beforehand, written by Melanchthon, of course, in 1530, and that's if you fast forward to today, from what I've understood, James, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe this is what you've heard too, but a lot of Lutheran churches around the world either subscribe to the Augsburg Confession. That's almost kind of a non-negotiable. All Lutheran churches, they consider themselves churches of the Augsburg Confession, but a lot of them will subscribe to the whole Book of Concord,
Right.
which are foundational Lutheran documents, and it definitely includes as a large part of it the Formula of Concord, and so which is
Right.
what is going to come up a lot on this episode, the Formula of Concord. Is that does that sound kind of basically what it is?
Yeah. I think the and I could be totally wrong on this, and if we have any LCMS folks who listen, they feel free to correct me.
Yeah,
I think that's what
it's about half our audience.
I
Maybe
think
maybe.
that's what I think that's what they would delineate between what they would call a quia and a quatenus subscription to
Yeah.
the Book of Concord. Is that right?
Well, there's that, but also I think there's not even the full subscription. If I'm correct, I think the ELCA only have a subscription to the Augsburg Confession, while the LCMS is the entire Book of Concord, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, that's what I remember hearing, and I basically went to an ELCA seminary, but
Yeah.
um, so now that distinction you talked about, the quia and the qua, that I think applies, you know, to the Augsburg Confession between those two major American church bodies, LCMS, ELCA,
Got it.
um, but either way, the Formula Concord is a pretty important statement because it was also a reconciliation, or at least an attempt of a reconciliation, because in theological um, development, there's never full reconciliation. There's always going to be some people that are unhappy. So,
Right.
um, yeah, the Formula of Concord is the reconciliation between the factionalism that arose within the Lutheran movement after Luther and Melanchthon died. And that's really what we're talking about today, is that factionalism. So,
Yeah.
I want to name four people because we're really talking about a lot of people in this episode. And a lot of them I just learned about for the first time. Well, not first time. Some of them I've learned about for the first time. Others I've known but learned more about. Um, and I want to name these four. Jacob, is it Andrea? I feel like
I think
that's
I've heard Jacob Andreae,
Jacob
but
Andre, Andraeea. I also feel like I've seen his name without the other A, but with like a what's that mark that goes over the
an accent.
an accent over the A. So yeah, Jacob Andre, who's a Tübingen professor of theology, he lived from 1528 to 1590. You got Martin Chemnitz, who lived 1522 to 1586. He's known as the second Martin, probably the most outside of being a well. Anyway, so these people I'm naming right now are were the main people behind the Formula of Concord. I should have prefaced by saying that. So Jacob Andre, Martin Chemnitz, who outside of being the primary author of the Formula of Concord, Chemnitz is also known for his massive 4-volume examination of the Council of Trent, which was a
Right.
kind of his I guess an apologetical work, you could say, his
Right.
defense of Lutheran Reformation theology against the theology of Roman Catholic theology of the Council of Trent. Um, you have Nicholas Selnecker, pastor and theologian, who's a student of Melanchthon, lived from 1530 to 1592, and another student of Melanchthon, David. This person's name is it
Hytrea is what I've heard, or what
Chytrea?
I've read, what I would think.
Yeah, is that does he take that from? That doesn't sound German. Is that Greek?
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. Being the student of Melanchthon, we talked about in the previous episode, Melanchthon's, they might be good for listeners. We haven't, if you haven't listened to the episode prior to this about
Right.
Melanchthon's, it's our review of Lohengrin's book about Melanchthon. Go ahead and pause and take a listen to that. Because yeah, it'll give some context here. So, Cotrea, is the last person we met. So there were others involved with the Formula of Concord, obviously, but these four, there's a lot of people who signed off on it, but these four were really the major players, the framers, if you will. And also they were also major people in this last half of the 16th century, which gets us into today's topic of second generation Lutheranism. So, there's it's often this period is often seen as a war between two parties or factions that Lutheranism split into. Uh, the Philippists versus the Flacians, or also the Philippists versus the Nasio-Lutherans, which Flacians are also referred to as. This is kind of anachronistic. It's sort of a simplification, which I'll get into in a little bit, because many second generation Lutherans did not fit neatly into under either of these labels. Some were intentional mediators trying to avoid, or they were really trying to seek a middle ground between these because they recognized that, each of these two camps brought up valid concerns. But as we'll see, even the people who tried to mediate, avoid, and who tried to avoid taking a side were nevertheless accused of being on one of the sides.
Right.
Andreae, this happened to Andreae. He definitely faced this in his efforts. To kind of sum up the scene, though, before we get into those finer details, in the second half of the 16th century, especially after Luther and Melanchthon's death, the movement that had really been started by Luther and developed by Melanchthon and Luther, the Reformation in Germany, um, it experienced conflicts within it, conflicts over theology that came about because of concerns different people had within the movement had. I think it's fair to say. I mean,
Yeah.
um,
No,
any
I
further
think that's right.
comment on that kind of setting the scene?
No, I think we'll dig a little deeper here in a sec.
Yeah. Um, and you and I both got interested in this period. I think it was like what, January, February? I don't know what it was
Yeah.
that uh prompted us to get into this. I can't really recall.
Well, I've always been interested in Matthias Flacius. Well, I say always, but over the last few years, I've gotten particularly interested in Matthias Flacius, and so I saw a book had come out by Wade Johnston
Mhm.
about Matthias Flacius, and so I was like, oh, I think I'd like to read that and maybe get to know him better. And then I read a little bit more about him and found that I really resonate a lot with what he had to say. It's just, there were a couple of places where he was maybe not as crisp as he should have been in his theological language, like with regard to the eradication of the image of God in the person and how that created some problems. But that all plays in rather nicely, I think, with what's going on, especially in the predestination controversies in early Lutheranism. So
The Flacius, Flacius. I pronounce it differently. Maybe potato potato.
yeah, probably so.
I'm going to call that party the Nasio Lutherans, which
Yeah.
Nasio is a Greek term meaning genuine. So these are the people that claim to genuinely represent Luther. Flacius is one of those people. We'll bring him up in a little while. But yeah, there is a book about him by Wade Johnson, professor at, I think, uh, is it one of the Concordia or
Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary.
Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, um, and friend on Facebook. So shout out to Wade, Dr. Johnson. So yeah, you started. I haven't read that book yet. How you did? How'd you feel? You
So I should say I read first Dr. Johnson's book on and it's called An Uncompromising Gospel, which is basically a sort of primer on Flacius and his theology. And then I read a little bit of I've read about half of the translated book that Johnston did with I think it was Dr. Kilcrease, that was a sort of primer on Flacius's big work, which is the key to the scriptures, which was sort of a book about interpretation, and that's
Yeah,
also
he was a biblical scholar, Flacius.
mhm.
That's kind of his well, back before those category, he was a exegete. A lot of his
Right.
work was commentary in the Bible. Yeah,
Biblical theology.
Jack Kilcrease did do has taken interest in Flacius, has written. I remember reading an article about
Mhm.
him by Kilcrease. For listeners, I'll some of the reading I've done in prep for this episode, I'll put links in the show notes. For this again, the next two, I think this is going to be a two-parter. I did not mean to. I'm sorry, Jen. I didn't mean to have 7 pages of notes. It just guys.
No, that's good. That's
Um,
good.
so for listeners, I'll put these links in the show notes. But in preparation, we read some things. But this is what I read. I read a lot from Robert Kolb, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I'm blessed to say is actually on my doctoral committee. I'll quit bragging now. Robert Kolb is the probably the leading North American born Luther scholar and one of the leading North American Reformation scholars. He's done a lot of research and writing and really he's done a lot of research and writing and really presenting for the first time in English a lot of these second generation Lutherans. And he does so particularly in a book he wrote titled Bound Choice, Election, and the Wittenberg Method. The subtitle of that is From Martin Luther to the Formula of Concord. So he basically covers the history from Luther, not Luther's death, but going back to like I think Luther's bondage of the will, because these second generations would be debating that work, the implications of that work, going from that time of Luther's career to the Formula of Concord in 1580, and then also I read a little from Kolb wrote a book about Jacob Andreae, who's an important mediating figure in these disputes we'll be talking about. And that book's called Andreae and the Formula of Concord, even though that's mainly a primary work. It's a translation of 6 of his sermons, but there's quite a bit of historical info preceding those sermons. And so that's a good book it's the first one's out of Lutheran Quarterly, the other one's out of Good Cordius. So I'll put links in the show notes. So again, but just to orient us, we're looking at this time period of, second half of the 16th century. And you read a bit of one of those Cole books. I think. Oh, you're
Yeah, the
holding
bound
it right
choice
there.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. It's a I mean, it's a thick book, but there's so many pages of bibliography. Has probably half bibliography because
Yeah.
he does so much, Kolb does so much kind of um summaries of uh these works that were only in Latin or German, written by these 16th century second generation Lutherans. These treatises, these sermons, whatever. I mean, a lot of them were not translated. So Kolb is kind of breaking them down, summarizing them, breaking them down in order to give the history, of the development of the disputes that happen in Lutheranism for the second half of the 16th century. It's really kind of a go-to book for that. It's definitely not it's definitely has it's kind of a more advanced theological read. Um, but and I imagine the other Kolb book I mentioned, Jacob Andreae and the Formula of Concord, it might be a much more accessible book as well. Not to sound elitist, but to be honest, we're at different levels of when we crack open theology. Um,
Right.
and I think you and I mentioned that we kind of struggle with parts of that book because there are certain philosophical, you know, um, suppositions discussed in that, which, someone who's not versed or someone who's not versed in reading that type of thing all the time, it's gonna,
Right.
you're gonna need to spend more time in it. So, um, but yeah, so I want to take a stab at defining the parties um the parties of the Philippists on the one end and the Nasio-Lutherans on the other, knowing that with a caveat, these are a lot of people in this period can't neatly fall into each, so there's
Right.
somewhat anachronistic. Though I will say I think the Nasio-Lutherans are more of a fixed group. I think it's more we can more neatly place some people into that,
Yeah.
you know. But the main issues that separated these two groups was how to what were, how to go about, well, what their views were on the Holy Eucharist, on freedom of the will, and on double predestination, or just predestination, you could say.
Right.
The I guess the Philippists, from what I understand, are, they get the name from Philip Melanchthon. It was maybe a derogatory term, I would guess, pejorative, given to, students, theologians of Wittenberg who were close with Melanchthon, maybe studied under him, worked with him, had the same humanistic tendencies, um, and they definitely um, grabbed onto some of Melanchthon's uh, accents and emphases of theology,
Right.
including some of the accents and emphases Melanchthon had that you could interpret to be at odds with Luther. That's what
Yeah.
I would call the Philippists.
Right.
Anything to add on the Philippists? I mean, that's kind of my summation of them, but
Yeah.
okay, nothing to add.
Um, I mean, yeah, the Philippists are an interesting group because they are very interested, like Melanchthon, in unifying the Lutheran and Reformed movements.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
they're ecumenical, or more, you
yeah,
could say. Yeah.
and because of that, they're more willing to concede ground to the Reformed, not on everything, because I mean, Melanchthon was strongly opposed to double predestination,
Mhm.
but in other areas, Melanchthon was just constantly looking for ways that he could connect the two. So, in a sense, he's one of the early ecumenists, um, and I think the Formula of Concord doesn't vindicate him so much as it vindicates the Nasio-Lutherans. So there's something to be said for that. Um,
It'll be interesting once we get into the Formula Concord, because I read it. I don't know. I really struggled once as I went to. I kind of struggled with the formula, and that might be into our second episode, because I know it's trying to be a reconciliation, or well, a seeking a way that would, you know, something that all the people could agree on. Um, and it seemed to me, yeah, that there were just some. It went for some type of rationalizing in certain areas that uh it doesn't really bring about the reconciliation, I would think, totally. But yeah,
right.
I don't know. So that's the Philippists, and then there's the Nasio-Lutherans, who interestingly are people that they could be seen more as like they want to be more faithful to, at least they could claim that they're more faithful to Luther, especially when it comes to uh where Lu what Luther says and where Luther is with with his writing, the bondage of the will. That would end up being an important writing that the Nasio-Lutherans would appeal to. And Nasio-Lutherans, as we'll see, have a strong allergy to anything that they perceive as synergism. I
Yeah,
think I told you that I think I said that about you, James, when we were
you did. Those exact words.
What's that?
Those exact words. Yeah.
I
I
did,
have
yeah.
I make no bones about sympathizing heavily with the Gnasio-Lutherans, which is part of my attraction to the theology of Matthias Flacius. Not just that he was a biblical theologian, but also a Gnasio-Lutheran. But I think one of the fascinating things about
I'm more of a Gallus fan of the Nasios. He's, you know, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
well, no. I think that what is so fascinating about this is that these are two schools of thought that most of these people were students of Luther and Melanchthon.
Well, the thing is with the Nasios, it's hit or miss. That's what fascinates me about them is that
Sure.
they're not all Wittenberg based. They come from other parts of Germany. That said, I don't spoil too much because when I bring up Amsdorf, as well as I think it was one of them had a father. He's later down in my notes, but one of these Nasio Lutherans had a father who like went to school with Luther in Erfurt. So they definitely have this, they can definitely claim the mantle of Luther in a different sort of way
Sure.
than the Philippists, who are a lot of them are in Wittenberg, and where Luther nailed the theses and everything, so they can be like, oh, we're in Luther land, but no, they both have clout in their different ways, I guess.
Sure. That's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
Which I think is interesting. It's one of the fascinating. But this is the irony I found. The irony is that on one, they disagree with each other. Um, but one was seen as warming up, Philippists are being seen as, you're being too warm to, you want to have a united Protestantism. You're very ecumenical. You're willing to make concessions. You're getting dangerously close to Calvinism. But at the same time, Gnasio Lutherans also, in a certain regard, became much closer to Calvinism than Philippists. I think that there's this great irony is that Philippists are closer to the Calvinists on the Eucharist as they entertained this spiritual presence understanding, while the Philippists are very opposed to Calvinists on predestination. We'll get into why. The Gnasio Lutherans arguably come close to Calvinism on double predestination while being very opposed to Calvinism on Eucharist. It's so
Yeah.
interesting that I don't know. Uh
Well, I was just talking to
that
somebody about this yesterday, actually, that Luther himself is within a hair's breadth of double predestination when you read the bondage of the will. But he just,
and that's what the Gnasio Lutherans, when they went about and citing it, they weren't
yeah,
making interpretive leaps. They're like, this is, so sorry, I cut
yeah.
you off.
Oh no. I mean, but like he just never he never took the nosedive into the hidden God, which is what
Right,
double predestination will do.
right. That's a fair way of saying it. Luther, he's still, I don't know, he's still able to like stop himself from
Right,
going over that
right.
edge. In ways that some of the new Gnasio Lutherans weren't, especially as we get into was it Spangenberg. Yeah, he flat out says some things that can be seen as virtually Calvinist. Uh, to revisit those four people I mentioned, those framers of the Formula of Concord, this is how I would classify them because I said how like the Gnasio Lutherans in this whole picture are, I think, much more definable, much more of a fixed group. But Philippists, it's like most of the people that were accused of Philippists probably wouldn't want to be called Philippists. So kind of looking at these four, I mentioned, the parties earlier. Um, but those four people I mentioned, if I absolutely had to put them in a box, I would say, or in reference to these two poles, I would say Jacob Andreae would be in the middle ground, who is accused at times of being a Philippist, although later really tried to side with Gnasio Lutherans on some things. Uh, I would put Chemnitz. I would put him in the middle ground and solidly so, but I haven't read as much, I'm ashamed to say, as I probably should have read on or about Chemnitz. And then Selnecker and Catrea, I would call Philippist light. But again, that's a problematic category, Philippist, because I think even Philip Melanchthon, if you read him charitably, he would be Philippist light. What do you agree with those kind of Did you kind of see the same? I sped read through some of this. Like, is that kind of
Sure.
how? how
I don't know.
those guys.
I might say that Chemnitz is maybe a little more eh, on the Gnasio-Lutheran side of the middle.
Okay.
I, I I mean, I just get that sense from the fact that much of what he and the others put in the Formula of Concord ended up supporting the Gnasio-Lutheran side. It's just they wouldn't go quite as far as some of the more maybe radical Gnasio-Lutherans.
Hmm. Well, so maybe we should define well, I already kind of said who the each group was, but we didn't really talk about their positions. Um, the Philippists, the Philip Melanchthon had, especially as um as time went on, Philip Melanchthon, as much as he would have said he held to that, we're justified by faith alone, we're saved completely on the part of what God through Christ has done for us. There's no action on our part that earns us or brings us salvation. As much as he would have very much said that he believed that, he also had a concern in protecting human integrity. And by that, what I mean is Melanchthon was concerned with that, that humans have, that the human will um is afforded the dignity that we can see the human will is able to do certain things, um is able to have a part, a more active part in its relationship with God. Because if you don't, it could logically follow that, well, nothing, no good or spiritual good we do really is is through our own will. It's all God acting through us as if we're like just puppets. He was and in that sense, God would then be responsible for the evil people do, because it's completely God who decides or doesn't decide, or controls or doesn't control what the good people do and the good people fail to do. I guess if that's, probably, it's probably a better way to put that, but Melanchthon didn't want to, he was concerned in protecting that the character of God in his theology, or from implying that God could be the cause of sin or something. That's one, maybe not but yeah, I mean, that's kind of the main reason
Mhm.
that he wants to have a place in theology for the human will. But this gets, when we're talking in reformational theology, uh, the that can get us on some shaky ground, because the Reformation is so centered on the teaching that it's not by our own power and will that we're saved, but completely uh, by God's action. Monergism, right?
Yeah.
And so you can understandably that Melanchthon got himself, in trouble, or got a lot of criticism after he started to have this emphasis.
Yeah, I think this is one of those places where being a systematic theologian or a systematic thinker can cause problems
Mm.
because you have to draw conclusions from assertions that are being made if you're a systematician, right? So Melanchthon uh, draws the conclusion that the will is in some way, at least partly free from the theological assertion that God is not the author of evil,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
But the problem is, if you look at the scriptures at face value, bare minimum, there are times where God does work people like a puppet. He did that with Pharaoh. He hardened Pharaoh's heart, right? It's very frequently the case that in that Exodus narrative, God is the one who hardens Pharaoh's heart. Then
Right.
you get, was it Saul, where God sent an evil spirit
Hmm.
into Saul, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, we need to think through what that means, but I think part of the problem is that Melanchthon was engaging in a little bit of special pleading,
Hmm.
and that caused problems. And I think it was noticed by some of his opponents because by virtue of his special pleading on some issues, he created a defective position on the freedom of the will. Does that
Hmm.
make sense?
No, it makes sense to me. And as I said, I think some of the, I don't know, if we're, yeah, there's downfalls of logically of trying to not extrapolate, but trying to follow a logical next step of
Right.
every assertion. I
Yeah.
think Melanchthon's guilty of that. I think Calvin, to an extent, is guilty of that in other
That's how
areas.
you get double
That's how
predestination.
you get double predestinate. In some way, I feel like this is kind of what I can, and I think Kolb started to allude to this a little bit in his book. My feeling as I'm reading about these, as I'm reading like how these people are so bogged down in these disputes and these debates, and really getting into the fine hair, combing the hairs, the weeds of these issues. I said, well, this is all fascinating, interesting, but at the same time, I don't know if I'm really satisfied because if I go with the Nasio Lutherans, I have some problems with some of the things they conclude. If I go with the Philippists, I have some problems with some of the things they conclude. It seems like both of them, in their own way, selectively perhaps, are trying to logically work things out. Right? And I love logic and everything. It works. It's good for so many areas of life. But Luther very much allowed himself to live in the tension, you
Hmm.
know, and he never either he either didn't recognize, or if he did, he did recognize he didn't recognize certain tensions because as a person living in a certain in 2005 I could not have given you the forecast of the political situation in 2025. We're all people in our time. You can't see the issues of tomorrow.
Sure.
So Luther is he can't foresee some of these things that the second generation of people are going to debate, predestination, free will, and everything. But
Right.
he does say some pretty solid things about those issues in his time, especially in bondage of the will and in his own theology. But then, um, if he does recognize a tension there, he's not interested in sorting the tension out so much because he's I don't know. It seems like when you get into the type of theologizing that the Philippists, the Nasio Lutherans, the Calvinists, all of them are doing. They're just rationalizing, and they're doing a lot of. Don't get me wrong, they're doing a lot of great things, but they're trying to just exhaustively speak on everything. And Luther would say you can't do that. I mean, you can't. None of
Right.
us can know it all, And so it's that's kind of what I take away ultimately from this. Um,
Yeah. Well, you're right. I think that Luther, as we've said on the podcast before, is was an occasional theologian.
yes.
So because of that, he was far more willing to say things that at face value could be considered contradictory, but it was because he recognized that there was a tension in the scriptures about that very thing.
Hmm.
So what Luther was doing is just being a good biblical theologian. And I think one of the failings of second generation Lutheranism, or what some might call Lutheran orthodoxy, was a kind of return to scholastic categories and scholastic ways of thinking. Luther was trying to break out of that because he felt like that was actually a really unhelpful hermeneutic for this very reason that you have to follow logic to reach a logical conclusion
Hmm.
when if logic is sort of greater than the revelation of scripture in a sense, then logic is in a sense God.
Right.
And I think Luther would have a real problem with that. Um,
Yeah.
Anybody should have a problem with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, we're not dissing logic. We kind of
Sure,
we use logic to make all those points we just made.
of course,
Ironically, against logic. That's that make your head explode.
of course,
Uh
but logic must always bow the knee to God. Um,
right.
and I think that's the main point I'm trying to get across. I think that's
Yeah.
what Luther was trying to get across too.
Right. Yeah. And that's not that type of humility I don't quite as see in a lot of these other, and I don't know, maybe because Luther was you know, I don't know, because he was a monk or something. I don't know. He was, but these other guys are just so university. They're so, there's
Right.
this kind of a contrast between them. Now I think it might, we're, again, this is going to be a 2 episode part because I think we're just going to now start to get into some of the debates here. As we mentioned, the debates really start to amp up, especially after the death of, Luther. Um, so I kind of spoke to this already. Kolb says on page 18, early on in that book, Bound Choice Election and the Wittenberg Method, he says that Luther's understanding of God and of the human creature, as well as his view of sin, required him to hold a series of elements in tension because he believed that to break through these tensions perverted or obscured fundamental components of the biblical message. I think that sums up basically what we just said, that um, Luther definitely held to certain things he gained from his study and meditation of the Word of God. And he had to hold those things to be true because they come from the Word of God. Um, and if tensions arise, yeah, they're not. To try to falsely harmonize or smooth over them was not in Luther's interest. So, and I think it's very interesting because I think how Kolb nails it. I mentioned kind of the mystique earlier of like, when Luther dies, you have all these people, a lot of them like sat at Luther's feet, or they had a father who was an associate of Luther or who went to school with Luther, right? It's not like Luther, they're separated by Luther by a degree-ish. They all had an acquaintance with him in some way, shape, or form. Some more intimately were friends. So there's this mystique, like, but they find themselves on these different sides, and I feel like it's something that kind of troubled me about this on one end was like they had such a reverence for Luther. And I don't get me wrong, Luther's one of my favorite theologians, but they had such a reverence for him, as
Hmm.
if he like it's like he's functionally almost like a pope. Do you
Yeah.
ever get like, and I get it. Luther was learned and he was a natural leader in ways, and so was Melanchthon. So they appeal to those two guys. But it seemed those it kind of bothered me a little bit. But to be fair, a lot of this generation of Luther in their debates, they did appeal a lot to scripture. It wasn't all just like what would Luther do? What would Luther say? Um, but he's important still for obvious reasons. But I always joke, when today I joke, when people often there's two people, kind of three, but there's definitely that's my dog's barking.
Uh-huh.
Two people, Jesus and Martin Luther King Jr., that everyone claims to have on their side. Jesus,
Yeah.
Jesus is of course living alive, but he's with us in a different sense than um, how you and I are like talking right now, obviously. Uh,
Right.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s dead, and you can't interview him to see what he thinks about this issue today or that issue today. And to a lesser extent, Bonhoeffer, because there's been a lot, there's been a lot about how, you know, conservative people like Metaxas claim Bonhoeffer, and then you have these progressive Christians that say, no, Bonhoeffer's our person. You get these people that, because they're so universally respectable and
Yeah.
admirable that, man, it would only help your cause if you can claim that that person would have been on your side. And I feel like that's what these that's what these two groups are doing with Martin Luther. to a
Hmm.
certain extent. So,
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I think when you cherry pick from a theologian or a major figure like Martin Luther King Jr., you can get them to say virtually anything.
mhm, right.
Um, I don't think that either one of these schools are doing that, but I do think that you're right that neither one of them gets Luther 100% correct. Um, I would argue that the Gnasio-Lutherans do get a lot closer to Luther than the Philippists, but the Philippists will quote as easily from Luther as the Gnasio-Lutherans will. So,
Right. Um, so the I came across this term. Um, well, why don't we get into, well, I did, so I want to kind of, I came across this term in my reading of Kolb. And you probably came across it too. And I'd never, this is the first time I'd ever seen it. In any Reformation history account, I've never seen this term used, this term, Stoic or Stoicism.
mhm.
Obviously, I've heard that term in other contexts, like actual Stoicism, like the ancient Greek,
Sure.
but or modern day, and we call people Stoic because they're, everything's inside and they don't have any expression. It's not what we mean here. Uh, the Stoicism and it's really seen kind of this debate, these two parties, if you will, if you could simplify it that way, the disputes in the second generation Lutherans is that you have one side being accused of synergism, the other being accused of stoicism. Um, the stoicism, as I read it, was the idea that uh, we any spiritual good we do and any coming to our salvation is completely, of course, the action of God and not ourselves. And so
Right.
we're basic. We're so that it's so on. It's so God. It's so much God's action that we are like blocks of wood. That was very much the charge that Philippists would say that Gnasio-Lutherans that you basically your anthropology, your estimation of humanity is that we're just blocks of wood that God acts upon. And they called this Stoicism.
Hmm.
Um, while synergism would be the charge the Gnasio-Lutherans would have said to the Philippists, saying that, you have maybe too high of an estimation of humanity, a high anthropology that sees humans as having, um, having an ability and a capability to cooperate with God and to work alongside God in your Christian life. Um, and I think I don't know. You may disagree, James, but I don't think either of these charges are fair on either of the parties.
Hmm.
Um, I think Gallus speaks beautifully when we get into the Nazi, because we named some of the Formula Concord people. I want to get into who some of these Gnasio-Lutheran people are. But for both of the, I mean, I don't. What are your thoughts on Stoicism and synergism? Were were those kind of exaggerations for one party to say it against the other, or were they onto something? I mean, I don't.
Well, I think the charge against the Philippists of being synergistic is, I think that's fairly self-evident, and especially in how Melanchthon changed over time to believe the will actually played a part in salvation. That's synergism in and of itself. I think Stoicism is used almost as an epithet, um, and I think I don't really have a problem with the idea of being considered a block of wood upon whom God acts, because God makes a beautiful creation out of the block of wood.
Mhm.
So for me, like, I don't feel like that insult lands. Um, and I'm perfectly happy, as you said earlier, my allergy to synergism is very strong. I'm perfectly happy that I don't play a part in salvation, because I know very well that if I did, I'd do something to muck it up. So, yeah. Uh,
Well, I know that later when we'll get into the Formula Concord, I think they settled on what perhaps the Philip Melanchthon and or the Philippists said at their best was that
Hmm.
it's not that the human will by its own natural capability or ability can bring itself to salvation or participate in spiritual good, but it's like God not infusing something into the will, but it's really God's will working through God's will makes the human will willing
Right.
to do the godly things.
Yeah, God's will transforms the human will.
Right. Yeah.
And
And I do think
that's
that
what
Melanchthon was, I think, trying to articulate that, but it only takes a slight, you know, awkward wording to make it perhaps change meaning or something. Or I don't know. Or
yeah.
give the impression that it means something else. But
Well,
um,
I know we were talking about maybe steering the rudder away from this, but this does actually touch on the concept of necessity too.
yeah.
So
Say more to that.
so when it comes to the part that the human will plays, or what happens to the human will, this is what Luther talks about in the bondage of the will as necessity of immutability or the immutable necessity,
Mhm.
which is the thing in and of itself um, has a nature and it's not going to change, not of its own internal capability. So the will itself is completely bound to sin. Um, and without external help, there's no way that it's going to change. So
Mhm.
Luther lands on the side of that as opposed to what would be called a coercive necessity that God breaks in and forces you to do stuff, or a necessity of foreknowledge, which is that God knows in his eternal mind what you're going to choose, and therefore it must happen because he knows it's going to happen. Luther would
Mhm.
say, your will is not going to change without an external force acting upon it. And what God does is he breaks in and does transform your will so that when you receive him in faith, God is the actor working in you. And I think it's a caricature to make you into a puppet. But God
Yeah.
is working in you to cause you to
Yeah.
desire the good.
Well, the puppet and wooden block analogies would work more to describe the coercive necessity,
That's fair.
which Luther is, of course, not of
Right.
that. He argues for a different kind of necessity for that concept of necessity. But yeah, and I think some of the Nasio-Lutherans may have gotten dangerously close to a coercive concept. But I do think, yeah, let's get into the Nasio-Lutherans, because I want to mention Gallus, who's kind of my favorite one, because he corrects that kind of caricature that you mentioned of the wooden block or actually puppet's the one I came up with because I think when a puppet's inanimate and is totally animated by maybe that could be a good analogy. I don't know. Well, I don't know. But I think it's worth noting to one, not that I'm trying to, uh always defend Melanchthon, but I do think Melanchthon really got himself in trouble because it was really during, I think it was the Augsburg interim when he was really trying to look out for the Reformational Church and protect it. And he tried to, find common ground, um, about how God can empower and enlighten our wills to do God's will. Um, the way he worded that, I'm trying to think what he even wrote something during the Augsburg interim, back when, he was trying to make peace with the empire, basically, as the Holy Roman Empire. And that kind of opened him up to that charge of synergism,
Mhm.
I think is when to kind of pinpoint a time where that really where everyone was like, look what Melanchthon just did. Uh,
Right.
Now the Nasio-Lutheran Party, I'll start with, even though he's not a second generation Lutheran, he's actually a contemporary of Luther and a fellow reformer and friend of Luther, and someone we should perhaps call a proto-Nasio Lutheran because it's before the factionalism, um, even though he lives into some of that time. But a man who was this guy was with Luther at the Diet of Worms. I mean, this is, and of course we're talking about Nicholas Amsdorf. Um, he's come I've come across him in Luther biographies, and he might have been in those movies we watched on Luther. But um, what amazes me is that I had no idea of Amsdorf's kind of this early Nasio Lutheran example being him. I always kind of glossed over him in the accounts, but he he because it's maybe tempting to see Nasio Lutherans because a lot of them aren't directly connected with Wittenberg as some sort of distorted offshoot of Luther's movement that felt they really got him but took things too far and maybe didn't have the clout that their opponents had. But here we have Amsdorf, who is like, you know, at ground zero, like Melanchthon was. I mean, he was literally at Diet of Worms, and Melanchthon wasn't at Diet of Worms, but or at least I don't think he was. Um, but here we have, Amsdorf, a close friend of Luther, and as we'll see, is had young associates, I think who were students of his, one of them being Flacius, Flacius. Um, and Amsdorf had basically he has some strong feelings against Melanchthon as it would come as far as the synergistic controversy. Amsdorf was really the one of the early opponents of Melanchthon in that. I had no idea of that. Shame to say.
Hmm.
I don't know if what you've read about Amsdorf, if you knew that too, but I had no idea.
No, no, I don't want to posture like I did. I didn't know much about North either. So,
The well, he lived from 1483 to 1565, so he's older than Luther.
mhm.
Uh, and he outlived Luther. So he saw, yeah, just wow. This makes him more interesting to me. Um, he took issue with the Synergists. And Kolb talks about how Amsdorf really saw that that he Amsdorf had this debate with a student of Melanchthon's named Pfeffinger. I don't, it's Pfeffinger, and he saw Pfeffinger as endorsing this idea of free choice that subverts what Luther wrote about in Bondage of the Will. And then after Amsdorf wrote this critique of Pfeffinger, the student of Melanchthon, um, Flashiest step. This is kind of Flashiest's first time in the spotlight, from what I'm gathering. Flashiest kind of enters the scene
Mhm.
amending Amsdorf. And so it's just interesting that connection. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Um, so Flashius, well, next, I guess that's a good segue. The next Nasio Lutheran we'll discuss is Flashius. We may be doing a whole, not to spoil too much, a whole episode about him, but he's very important in all this, and perhaps went in a rather extreme direction of a lower than low anthropology that even Lutherans would end up rejecting. Do you want to say more to that?
Yeah. When it comes to what happens in the fall,
As in the fall of man.
the fall of humanity, the fall from grace, original sin, what most people would say is that the image of God is somewhat obscured in human beings, and it has to be restored. Lutherans would go a little farther and say that it's irreparably damaged outside of God's grace, but Flacius went farther and said it's eradicated. And that's the problem, because if the image of God is eradicated from humanity, then how can Christ come to humanity and redeem humanity? Um, I think that's a valid concern, and I think that Flacius did go too far. And I think part of the problem is that Flacius was not as crisp on philosophical categories as some of his Philippist opponents were, and they were really easily able to trap him.
That's what
Um,
happened. They lured him into calling like sin the substance, right,
right,
of a
exactly.
human.
The
Yeah, they're
being,
having this debate. Yeah, and these Philippists are throwing all this Greek philosophy, well, categories, and Flashy's just falls right in for the trap.
yeah.
Well,
And I really feel for him because I would have fallen into that trap headlong too, being as
mhm.
allergic to synergism as I am. And so I think there's something really endearing about him that he didn't really believe that. I don't think he really believed that the being of human beings is sin, because if Christ is sinless, how can he become human if the being of humans is sin,
Right.
right? It wouldn't work. It philosophically can't work.
Jesus is the true human, what humans are meant to be. Yeah.
Right. Now, granted, Paul does say very clearly in 2 Corinthians 5:21 that Christ becomes sin. He
Well, yeah,
becomes
that's a
the
different,
embodiment of
yeah,
sin. But you're
right.
right, it's a different category. So
Yeah,
so again, clarity there is important. But yeah,
right.
you're right. They roped him in because he was not as crisp on those categories, and I think it was just honestly one of the earliest trolls of the
Yeah. Who was he debating in that debate? I can't recall. I tried to find it later.
it was a
It was one of the
Philippist.
it was one of the Philippists, yeah. Well, and we
Give me
have
one
another
sec. I'll
episode.
see if I
Well,
can.
yeah. Um the while James is going to get that book, okay, he's coming back. I did want to bring up Gallus, James, Nicholas Gallus
Yeah, yeah.
lives 1516 to 1570. Interestingly, he's a Nasio-Lutheran who studied, but he was a student of Melanchthon, and
Ah,
he's a Wittenberger. Presumably, he studied under Luther as well. I find Gallus the most interesting of the Nasio-Lutherans, um, because Gallus argued that characterization that Philippus made of Nasio-Lutheran anthropology as
mhm.
dead blocks of wood, as Gallus points out how that's a straw man. Because for a while I couldn't understand, like, okay, Philippus are calling Nasio-Lutherans anthropology, that humans are little more than dead blocks of wood in this theological schema. And I'm like, well, I can't help but see that Philippus are maybe correct in that. Like, but Gallus offers, I think, a better illustration. I think he offers a corrective. And this is what Kolb says. He says, quote, Gallus affirmed that the fallen human will should not be compared to a block of wood, since it is active in rejecting God's word until the Holy Spirit has changed it into a new creature. The relationship between the Creator, who is restoring his fallen creatures through the recreating word of Jesus Christ, and those creatures could not be comprehended within the Stoic philosophical framework. For it presumed no such creator God and could only pose the alternative images of a freely willing being or an automaton than when treating the functioning of the will. Gallus, in marked contrast, regarded the relationship between God and human creature as comparable to that of parent and child, and that presuppositional framework set the discussion of the will for Gallus on a different basis. So just as how the child's will always naturally goes against the will of the parent can not coerce, but draw the child, into the right way. But it always takes the constant attention of that parent. I don't know, James, you're a parent. Is that true of a parent-child relationship? Um,
Uh, Coercion doesn't typically work because the law arouses opposition.
right, but
Uh,
right.
yeah, so
So,
as a parent, I try and teach my kids the right way,
mhm.
and when they don't do it. I try coercion, that doesn't work. But yeah,
Well, those are Kolb's words describing Gallus's position, and he's of
yeah,
course paraphrasing. It's just work as a Latin title. I couldn't even and the way it's footnoted, it's like it's I'd have to go back a lot of footnotes to see the full title
yeah,
because it was a repeated footnote. But so that's yeah, so Gallus was my favorite in that because it's like, okay, I can understand that. That's more helpful for me to see it, the analogy of a parent-child than a block of wood, because a block of wood wouldn't have a resistant will, right?
yeah.
It would just be a, you know,
It doesn't have a will at all.
it wouldn't have a will at all, right?
Yeah. The guy,
Um,
by the way, the guy that debated Flacius was Victorinus Striegel
yes, Striegel.
at
Yeah,
the Weimar Disputation.
Striegel was a little snake.
I
So
was thinking the more theological term of douche.
okay, dude. Yeah, we were yeah. Well, I mean, people can yeah, see, they can see clearly what sides we're taking. I don't I honestly don't take a side. For me, it's kind of like pick a poison. I kind of like where Luther left it at, and these two parties for all their strengths, uh, I just can't. I'm with Chemnitz and Andreae. They reconciled it. They were the middlemen, supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're more compelled by the Formula of Concord than by either side that was in the debate that led to the Formula of Concord.
Yeah, but even I feel like the Form of the Conqueror was a needless. I don't say needless. uh Needless debates that happened, so they had to have a needless thing to settle it. So I don't know.
You literally just pissed off every single LCMS
Also,
person.
they're turning it off right now.
That's
Some
right.
might agree. I don't know. They said, well, they might. I mean, think about it. Uh, Nothing would have had been said if there wouldn't have been people wrong in the first place. I don't know. If there wouldn't have been Arius, you wouldn't have had to formulate the Nicene Creed. Or
Right.
does God use bad people to make good things? Ooh.
I mean,
Arius was God's will. I don't know.
well,
We're gonna be
no,
we're connecting the dots here.
no,
Yeah.
I think that's actually, I think it's perfectly reasonable.
Okay.
God uses bad people to chasten his people, right? I mean, he uses the very, very different invading peoples of the greater the area around the Holy Land, like the Edomites, the Amorites, they invade and chasten Israel, and Israel returns, right?
Hmm.
So God can absolutely use evil people for his ultimate good. I
Yeah.
mean, I think the quintessential example of that would be with Joseph, where his brothers sold him into slavery, and then Joseph literally says at the end of Genesis, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good."
I think didn't the Philippists, and I think the Formula of Concord went with this line of argument that God isn't using God allows evil but isn't behind it.
God is not the source of evil,
Yeah.
but he allows it.
It
And I think
allows it. Right. I think that's kind of the Philippist line though. I
that
think
is.
because I think the Nazios, some of them might go as far to say they might not say God is the source of it because they know they would fall into the accusation, but they would say they would have God is more active in that of the Amorites doing what they do rather than allowing the Amorites, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I was going earlier on when we were talking about this at the outset with like Pharaoh,
Mhm.
that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's not Pharaoh's heart was hardened or Pharaoh hardened his heart. I think there are a couple of times where it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, but the rest of it's God actively hardening Pharaoh's heart to achieve the
Yeah,
purpose of getting his
that's,
people out of Egypt.
that's the way the text certainly reads. At least in English. I don't know.
It is in
Um,
Hebrew too.
yeah. Well, the we're almost at time, and I wanted to bring up one more Nasio Lutheran. I guess do we need to do another episode? I don't know if I mean I do kind of want to talk about how it was settled, if it was settled. That's the great question.
Hmm.
And we can probably we could probably do that. So listeners, stay tuned. We're definitely going to have an episode on Flacius, and so there'll be more. We're going to tie up some of this stuff one way or another. But I
Right.
did want to mention one more Nasio-Lutheran, Spangenberg. It's probably Spangenberg. His first name, I think it's Syriacus.
Syriacus.
Syriacus, yeah. This is the Nasio-Lutheran whose father, Johannes Spangenberg, went to college, went to university with Luther at Erfurt, and later on, Syriacus, the son, is the one who becomes this Nasio-Lutheran. He's a tenant of Luther's at the Black Cloister, right? I mean, the inn that, Luther's inn that a lot of these young students stayed at. And so again, Nasio-Lutheran lineage traces back to this deep acquaintance with Luther through Spangenberg. He he would go on to say this. He was very much on the Nasio side of upholding monergism. And this is what kind of got him in trouble. He says, quote, divine predestination. And remember, before I get farther into the quote, whether you are a Lutheran or Reformed or whatever, or Lutheran Calvin, whatever, really arguably every Christian believes in predestination in a sense. The biblical sense of predestination is, you could say, a single predestination, right? Which is just that word of comfort and assurance that is given to believers of their that God has chosen them and that nothing can take them away from him and that they're destined for heaven is right. It's meant of a word of assurance. There's not the inference of saying, well, God doesn't choose then some others. That'd be called double predestination.
Hmm.
But anyways, Spangenberg says, divine predestination is an eternal, certain, inalterable, powerful counsel and conclusion of God to make a considerable group from among the entire human race righteous, to save these people and to glorify them. But later on, then, he says, on the other hand, eternal condemnation in the fire of hell has been prepared for those who are not elect according to divine righteousness, as Christ himself says in verse Matthew 25, verse 41. Unquote. So I think this is what gets him in trouble because at least virtually he's starting to sound like a Calvinist. That he went to the length of saying, well, and for there's also condemnation spelled out for others. Now the thing is, he is quoting from Matthew, and
Sure.
from Matthew 25. Did I get that verse right? Is there a 25, 41? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
where
the
Jesus
sheep and the goats.
yeah, then he'll say to those, depart from me, you cursed into the eternal fire prepared for the devil. And his angels, I don't know if that's a correct interpretation of that verse in this. I don't know. I wouldn't. That's kind of no.
No,
So
I think that definitely goes a little too far.
yeah. And so that's I think that's maybe a good note to end on because we'll talk more about this um in some regards because we're doing another episode or at least one more on this period and on these people, on the Asian Lutherans particularly. And so I think this example of him and his sermons on predestination, which I just quoted, is really what kicks off the predestination um, debate between the Nasio Lutherans and the Philippists, uh, which is related to the free will debate as well. They're very intricately they're connected, free will,
Hmm.
predestination. So, yeah, any takeaways from, I mean, we spent the last few weeks, you know, did this, were you, was it formative for you in any way, or was it, I don't know, enlightening in any way, the last few weeks of us kind of going over this stuff in preparation?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I've done a lot of primary reading in Luther, but I hadn't done a lot of primary reading in second generation Lutherans. So that portion of things is helpful and interesting, and reading about them through people like Dr. Kolb. I think that I still am gonna default more to Luther than to the second generation because
Mhm.
I think in the end, some of it I wouldn't say it was needless, but some of it can eventually arrive at like splitting hairs.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that also in the end there is a side, in my opinion, that's more right than wrong.
Hmm.
Uh, and so yes, has it been formative? Yes, because it's helped to solidify some of the things that I already felt like were true by showing that I'm not the first one to think these things.
Oh, certainly not. Yeah. Well, and you said it earlier. I don't even know if we were recording yet, but sort of that seismic shift that Luther was.
Right.
Uh, the subsequent generations could not help but to have to make some sense with the pieces left.
Yeah.
And so I didn't mean to sound like, because I don't like it when people dismiss all theological work as like, people just splitting hairs or being too
Sure.
far in the weeds. I think that's a lazy, anti-intellectual thing that I see in the church sometimes. And some of the aversion that some in the church, some of the leadership in the church have to theology.
Yeah.
I do
For
think
sure.
a lot of academic theology can be too obtuse and is um, that's a whole nother story. But yeah, I agree with you, man. It's for me, it kind of, I don't know if what it solidified for me. I think I'm still trying to figure that out. Because for me, the question of the what the will does, um, I don't know. I think I'm happy. I think with what the way Andreae and Chemnitz, the FC people settled it. Um, because yeah, I mean, it's just it's a vexing question, and the two parties both said things that made a lot of sense. Um,
Right.
you know, and it's easy to it's easy to fall into the trap of Pelagianism with one of the side of that debate, and it's easy to fall into this kind of just passive, um, ultra passive, cheap grace type of attitude on the other. And so it's, and I don't know what the answer is to fix, to prevent both of those, other than to live in the tension of them.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's to wrap it in a bow. I think that's what Luther did.
Yeah, I think yeah, and yeah, it's right, but yeah, they left a lot of pieces that they had to pick up, and that's just what happened. And however positively or negatively we want to look on that second generation, it certainly is fascinating what the debates they had. I mean, and
Be
yeah,
sure.
I've greatly enjoyed it because it was really my first time, looking at that,
Hmm.
looking at that period. Um, so yeah, well, thanks for coming on, James,
Yeah.
and doing this. Well, listeners, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. God bless, and we'll be more of this broader topic the next time. Take care.